You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Building on last week's critique of political scheming, Qoheleth now reveals what truly makes life worth living. This week we'll discover the 4 pillars of a meaningful existence: savoring good food, enjoying your favorite drinks, finding joy in your work, and cherishing time with loved ones. That might not be the message you expected to hear from the Bible, but that is what Ecclesiastes 8 has for us. These everyday moments aren't just mundane, though. They're actually the secret to overcoming life's challenges and even to defeating evil. Let's round out our study of chapter 8 by learning how these simple pleasures can lead to a profound and fulfilling life. Last week we went through the first 9 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 8. So if you haven't yet listened to that episode, I do recommend you go back and give that one a listen first, because it sets up what we're talking about here now in the second half of chapter 8. I'm going to go ahead and read through verses 10 through 17 so we can get an idea of what Qoheleth is saying. He says, "I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy. They were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is Hevel. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it will be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. But it will not be well for the wicked, neither will he prolong his days, which are a shadow, because he fears not God. There is a vanity, a hevel, that is done upon the earth, that there be just people to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Also there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said, this is Hevel. Then I commended mirth, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, because that will abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God gives under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done upon the earth, for also there is that neither day nor night sees sleep with his eyes. Then I beheld all the work of God, that a person cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a person labor to seek it out, yet he won't find it. Indeed more, though a wise person thinks they know it, yet they're not going to be able to find it." There's a good amount going on here in these verses, and a lot of it can be difficult to translate over well into English, just like you've probably seen from the previous episode and honestly several of the episodes in this Ecclesiastes series. So I just want to take a second to note that this diversity of interpretations and even translation options is not something that should concern us. In the circles that I grew up in, we very much focused on the one right interpretation. And not only that, we also focused on what we believe to be one right translation of a passage. And that was pretty much always exactly whatever the King James translation of the Bible into English had, no questions asked. While this is not a series on Bible translation issues or versions or even how to interpret the Bible, that's all stuff for another day in the future. I think that Ecclesiastes has given us a lot of room to consider the fact that that idea of only one right translation or only one right interpretation is honestly a pipe dream. It doesn't exist. Now, that's not to say that all translations or all interpretations are completely equal in value or equally valid. There are some just straight up bad translations. There are just some straight up bad interpretations. But there's a lot of room in between. There's only one good interpretation and one good translation, and all are good or all are bad. There's a lot of room in between. There's a lot of gray area there that we don't have to do this either or black and white. We can look at a variety of translations. We can look at a variety of positions and learn from them. As we've gone through this study now, we'll be finishing up chapter 8 here this week. I've offered several different takes on several different verses, and I can't help but think that some of you listening may have walked away from that particular episode with a different interpretation of a verse than I took. I might have said I lean this way, but here's another option, and so you might have taken the other option, and that's okay. The Bible is a very rich, diverse book that has been significant for millennia. With the New Testament, we've already got roughly 2,000 years of people using it, and then for different portions of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, you can add several hundred more years onto that. And it hasn't gone that way by saying, here's the one way to read this. That's a really fast way to make something irrelevant and to limit it to a particular time frame. It's only because we're able to look at it from different views that we continue to learn things from it. The Bible's not a one-dimensional text. So again, I'm not saying you have to accept every single interpretation out there, but I think Ecclesiastes is a really good illustration or example of how the Bible has a lot of complexity that the average preacher isn't going to tell you about. And I get it. The stuff that we talk about on this podcast, some of it just wouldn't feel right in most church scenarios. Most people don't go to church to hear the kind of thing that we talk about here. We get a little too nerdy for that. And that's okay. There's different settings for different things. But we have to acknowledge that this stuff that we talk about here on the podcast exists. We can't just act like the nice clean cut version you get in church every Sunday is the full picture. We have to acknowledge that there is complexity, there is nuance. There are times when we just go, I have no clue what the original writer here meant. This is like really, really hard to translate. Or where we say, you know what, there's 4 different possible interpretations here, and all of them make sense. So take your pick. That is okay. But we have to acknowledge that that is okay. And we have to acknowledge that that is real and not just try to put up this fairy tale version of the Bible that doesn't exist, where there's one right way of looking at it that we all have to get to. And if you stray from that, you're a horrible, rotten sinner. That's part of why I wanted to do this series now. I know Ecclesiastes is not a very common book of the Bible. And so, since there aren't too many portions of it that people are familiar with, I figured that this would be a really good opportunity to share with you just how much diversity of opinion there is when it comes to interpreting and translating the Bible. And I'm not stepping on any sacred cows if I tell you, Ecclesiastes 8 verse 10 has 3 different ways that you can translate it, which it does. Actually, more than that. We'll be talking about that in just a second here. But no one's offended by that. If I picked a famous verse out of the New Testament, or, somebody's life verse or memory verse that they learned as a kid and said, well, that might not actually be what it means, that ruffles feathers. So hopefully here, by dealing with some less popular texts, you're able to get a little more comfortable with the idea that diversity of translation and diversity of interpretation is not the enemy of a faithful Christian. It actually helps us to be able to understand and appreciate the text even more. So, since I mentioned Ecclesiastes 8:10, let's look at that. I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the place of the holy. Now, that is actually the words for holy place that's used several other times in the Tanakh. So I'm not entirely sure why the King James went with place of the holy here. That makes it sound to me like these wicked people went into, like, I don't know, a part of town where a bunch of really righteous people lived. But it's actually the word for the holy place. So it's suggesting then that they went into the temple. And that's a significant difference. So I really wish that they had just translated it the way they did in so many other parts of the Bible. I guess maybe they didn't want to say that wicked people went to the temple, but I mean, they did, We shouldn't just assume, oh, everyone who ever went to the temple was this perfect Yahweh-fearing person that you could entrust with all of your finances and even your children. No, I mean, just think about church today. I realize the Israelite religion and the Christian religion are not a one-for-one correspondence, and the tabernacle or temple and the church are not one-for-one correspondence, but still, for the sake of this illustration, think about church today. And all of the people across the world, or in America, or in your state, or in your town, or heck, even in your church, that attend faithfully every week. Would you trust every single one of those people with your finances, or with your children? Probably not. Just because someone is faithful in church attendance does not make them a good person. And this is what irks me when you get certain churches, and this happened a lot in the Baptist tradition that I came from. I don't know if it happens in other traditions, I would imagine it does, but there was a heavy emphasis placed on faithfulness. And so much so that, particularly on like anniversary Sundays where we would celebrate, the anniversary of the church's incorporation, we would recognize people who had been going to the church for so many years. And usually I think it started at like 10 years, and then we'd recognize people who'd been there for 15, 20, 30, 40. Heck, we had some people that had been there for over 50 years at the church. And that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's bad or that we shouldn't appreciate that, but faithfulness doesn't automatically equal good. Somebody can continue to go faithfully to a church every single time the doors are open and be a horrible person. I mean, heck, pastors do that every single week, and not every pastor is a good person, right? Just about every week we get some sort of news story of some clergy member who has, been involved in sexual abuse or financial scandal or something along those lines. And they're there every week. Faithfulness does not equal goodness. Now, it doesn't mean that we should totally ignore, if someone's been faithful for 40 years, they can be recognized for that. But we have to ask, what kind of person are they? And do they deserve that recognition for things other than just constantly showing up? And I guess I'm going to go on a little rant here, but same thing with a marriage. When somebody says, oh, I've been married for 20, 30, 40 years, and everybody claps or cheers or whatever, and I'm going, okay, tell me what your marriage is like, and then maybe I'll clap for you. See, longevity does not automatically deserve praise. Any old schmuck can sit his butt down in the same place every single week or even multiple times a week and still be a horrible person outside of that. Any person can stay in a relationship because it's easier or cheaper than leaving. What matters is the quality, not necessarily the quantity. Now, if you've been married for 40 years and it's a fantastic relationship, yeah, that would be pretty impressive. But that doesn't automatically mean that. And so same thing here. And all of this is just speculation on why the King James may have said place of the holy instead of holy place. And maybe they just didn't want to think that wicked people went into the holy place. But I mean, surely they did. Because we have people who are abusive a-holes that are in church every week. And the world we live in isn't actually that much different than the world back then. Sure, technology is different, culture is different, but people don't really change across the generations. We're still human beings. So I think that it's better just to say the holy place and to acknowledge that these are people who were morally bankrupt and yet still attending quote unquote church, if you will, every single week. They were going through the motions. They were checking the boxes. They were, probably some of the biggest givers at the temple. They were some of the most faithful. Maybe they taught Sunday school. Maybe they were on a deacon board, if you will. Obviously, those are church terms, and we're talking about Old Testament Israel, but you get the idea. And it's even possible that they were praised for this. We'll get to that in a second, but depending on what translation you have, the second half of the verse may say that they were praised in that city. Before we get to the second half of the verse, though, we have to acknowledge that there is a difference of opinion in how to translate the first half. And it's going to deal with the original language manuscripts and which path you decide to take on that. One option is to say that these wicked people were buried and they used to go to and from the holy place. That's what the King James has here. You also have an option of saying that I saw the wicked approaching and entering the holy place. So it's possible, depending on how you translate a couple words and which manuscript evidence you go with, it's possible to say that this has nothing to do with them dying and being buried, but just that they were approaching and entering the holy place. That's option 2. Option 3, and this comes from the Greek Septuagint that was compiled a little bit before the time of Jesus. It's a Greek version of the Hebrew Tanakh. And that says, to the tombs they are brought, and from the holy place. So that's relatively similar to the first option. It just slightly changes what's being said by saying that they are carried to tombs. And maybe they were carried out of the holy place from there. In that instance, maybe it's saying they were struck down in the holy place. That doesn't quite work as well, though, I think, because what we're going to see in this chapter is Qoheleth is saying that people can be righteous and still get treated as if they were wicked, or, still have a bum lot in life. And people can be wicked and cut corners and be abusive and yet still thrive and succeed, like you would think would only happen to the righteous. So I don't think the Septuagint translation is great here. I think it adds in or infers or implies some stuff that just isn't necessarily what he was probably going for. Now, in the second half, we have a little bit of a translation difference in how scholars think the word for forgotten should be translated. Depending on which definition you go with, and even what root word you think it comes from, it could mean forgotten, praised, or boasted. So you could have it saying that the wicked had come and gone from the holy place, and they were forgotten in the city. That's how the King James has it. You could have they were praised in the city where they had acted wickedly, or you could have they boasted in the city where they had acted wickedly. Now, let's just look at how the King James has it and acknowledge that it doesn't make a ton of sense as it stands, because it reads that the wicked were buried who had come and gone from the holy place, and they were forgotten in the city where they had been wicked. This is Hevel. Now remember that Hevel is something that's enigmatic, something that's hard to understand, something that's hard to grasp hold of, something that's frustrating, baffling. That's not this. If the wicked died and were forgotten in the city, that sounds like justice. That does not sound like Hevel. That sounds like it would be a good thing. So I don't think the King James translation here makes a ton of sense. It could make sense if you change the word forgotten into boasted. So the wicked buried, they had come and gone from the holy place, and the city where they had boasted about what they had done. This is Hevel. That could possibly work, because then you have this idea of them being proud of their abusive actions and, maybe just sharing the story with the boys and joking around about it and thinking they got away with it. But there's another option that I think makes even more sense of Qoheleth saying that all of this is Hevel at the end of the verse, and it's to translate that verb forgotten as praised. So the wicked had come and gone from the holy place, and they were praised in that city. That would make sense why he said this is Hevel, because we all know situations like that where somebody is not deserving of a promotion at work, right? They are just an absolute a-hole, they cut corners, they're dishonest, they backbite, maybe they gossip, they spread rumors about other people so that they can get the promotion, and yet they do actually get the promotion. Same thing happens in religious contexts. Same thing happens in churches today. We have people who are praised because of their hard work ethic, when really they are horrible people who lie, cheat, and manipulate to get their way. But they do get their way. Sometimes life actually works out for the people that it shouldn't. I mean, just look at the most powerful and wealthy people in the world today. Very few of them are actually decent human beings. The vast majority of the world's billionaires and politicians and CEOs are really questionable people when it comes to ethics. Not the sort of person that I would want to trust with any of my money or my children if I had any. So that's definitely a possibility that makes sense. But, go figure, there's still another possible way of translating this verse. See, the whole way that we have been talking about so far has assumed that the entirety of the verse is talking about the wicked person. But forgotten or praised or boasted, whatever you want to translate that verb as, has an assumed subject built into it. There is no subject right there. It's like if I said, Colin went to the store and he ran back home. In English, I have to supply the he so that ran back home has a subject. But in a lot of other languages, that can be built right into the verb itself. And Hebrew is one of those languages. So some scholars look at this and think that the second half of the verse is actually talking about the righteous. And so then forgotten makes sense if we go back to the original translation of that word. So if we supply the righteous as the subject in the second half, you get the verse saying, I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the holy place, and the righteous were forgotten in the city where this had happened. This is Hevel. So, in other words, the wicked got a burial. They got recognized for their contribution in the holy place, all while the actual righteous people were forgotten and overlooked. So we have room to debate what exactly this verse means. Either way, we get the idea that this is a frustration he has where righteous people don't always get rewarded for it. You can have the best people in life are often the ones that aren't actually that well off, and then the people who are really well off are often the ones who didn't really deserve it. Not saying they didn't work for it, but they had to cut corners morally to get there, maybe. Or they're just bad people, because they have focused so much on their career and their success and not enough on their character. So that's the heart of what Qoheleth is getting at here. As we get into verse 11, he notes that because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of humanity is fully set in them to do evil. Now, this could mean that human government is slow to act against crime, which, especially in the world that we live in today with all the bureaucracy, all the red tape, I mean, heck, it can take months and years for a trial and a sentencing. So it could be saying that human government is slow to act against crime. It's possible, and it is often the case. Or Qoheleth could actually be making this accusation against God because the wicked don't seem to get punishment in this lifetime often. It leads more people to want to follow in their footsteps. I'm definitely going to step on some toes here, but this made me think of the popularity of kind of small B-level celebrities in today's culture. I don't mean necessarily like the big-time movie stars or the big celebrity names that we know, as much as maybe the ones that are a little more niche, like people who are popular on YouTube or certain social media platforms. I even think of someone like, and here's where I'm really going to get some flack from some younger listeners, but someone like Andrew Tate, who has made an entire brand on being an abusive a-hole to other people. And he's been very successful with it. And so it leads more and more people to want to follow in his footsteps because they see the fancy life that he gets to live and the seeming lack of consequences for his actions. So I think that Qoheleth is kind of eyeing up people like that and saying that you can be a complete, can I say this here on the podcast? You can be a dick to other people and seem to get away with it. So that's just going to make other people think, oh, I can act that way and get away with it too. And so in this case, he's placing the blame on God and kind of saying, like, why aren't you doing something about this? Remember, the whole idea with the book of Ecclesiastes is he has found this glitch in the black and white system that a lot of the Bible's other wisdom literature, like Proverbs, presents. You read Proverbs and you walk away thinking the person who pleases God is going to have a good life, the person who sins all the time is going to have a horrible life. And Qoheleth says, yeah, maybe that's the case sometimes, but I found a glitch in the system, a flaw in the matrix. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you can be a horrible person and seem to lead a very successful, happy life. And then sometimes you can be the sort of person who's trying to do all the right things and just constantly have life not turn out the way that you think it should. And some theologians build on that thought with the second half of the verse where it says, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. And they try to make this a statement of total depravity. Now, if you're not familiar with that, congratulations. That means you don't come from a Calvinist background. But seriously, the idea of total depravity is a popular Christian doctrine that says that human beings are totally depraved, that on our own, without being Christian, we are 100% prone to sin. We can't do any good thing. And as far as God is concerned, unless you're a Christian, you are just this horrible, rotten person who can do no good in life. Now, I know some theologians will debate me on that, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. And even if you can try to semantics your way out of that sort of definition, that's what the average person in the pew gets trickled down the idea of when they hear preachers who believe in total depravity talk about it. Now, we have not talked a ton about Calvinism on the podcast. Eventually, I'd like to. I've just kind of touched on it a few times, but I have several friends who are Calvinist Christians. Some people view it as a denomination. I don't think that's an accurate representation. It's more so a belief system, and it's based on teachings of John Calvin and several popular Christian writers and speakers and preachers. You can pretty much guarantee that any popular theologian or even Christian musician probably leans Calvinist. So you will see this in the writings and preaching of people like John Piper, John MacArthur. You'll see it come out in theology in a lot of contemporary Christian worship songs as well. And they focus very heavily on this idea that human beings apart from God are totally worthless. Now, this is not an episode on Calvinism or total depravity, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But just to point out that that is not as black and white of a clear-cut doctrine in Scripture as a lot of people seem to think. Now, there is something to viewing yourself realistically as someone who is flawed, someone who has a bent within them to do wrong. There is value in acknowledging that about yourself. However, since a lot of Christians hear this message over and over and over again, it goes beyond that to the idea that they then start beating themselves up in a way that they would never talk about anyone else, but they just start to see themselves as this horrible, rotten person who has no good value to them. And personally, I think that God would disagree with the idea that you can't do anything good outside of being a Christian, because there are plenty of people in the world who do good things without being Christian. Now, theologians would come in and say, yes, but I'm talking about good works in the sense of anything getting you to heaven. But then they would also say that Christian good works don't get you to heaven either. So it kind of ends up in this not quite circular reasoning debate, but basically you just start talking in circles and not getting too far there. So the average Christian who hears this just starts to think, I am a horrible person, even though I am a Christian, which kind of misses the whole idea of the total depravity doctrine in the first place, that it's supposed to be about people before they are saved. But again, just pointing out, that is not necessarily as clearly taught in Scripture as a lot of people think it is. The Bible does talk about our having a flaw within us and our needing someone or something to resolve that, and God being that answer, and in particular Jesus as you get into the New Testament. But I think a lot of Calvinist presentations of this take it significantly further than it has to go, and they turn it into this basically just shaming speech just for existing as a human being, like you should be ashamed of who you are. And I think that goes way too far. And that's not even what I think this verse is talking about. I think when preachers try to twist this verse into saying that people are just fully set on doing evil, there is no good thing in a person, that they're actually missing what is at play here. It's way more intriguing than that. See, the end of the sentence could be translated, therefore the heart of the sons of humanity is fulfilled in them by doing evil. That word translated fully, or as I put it, fulfilled, is the word for consecrating something as a priest. In our Genesis 1 episodes, we talked about how God's blessing to fill the earth was also a form of consecrating the earth as his temple. It's a little bit of a weird idea for us moderns, but once you wrap your mind around it, it makes a lot of sense. And Bible Project in the past few years has done some really great material on that you can look into as well. And then if you add on to that concept, the Genesis 3 language that we saw last week of both knowing and evil mentioned side by side a few verses before this, now we see this as another creation hyperlink. And did you notice that even though sons of humanity is plural in this verse, it said the heart, singular, of the sons, plural, of humanity is fulfilled in them by doing evil. This, I think, is a callback to a similar construction in Genesis 6, where God said the singular heart of humanity, plural, was evil or ra throughout a person's lifetime. So I think this verse is actually a reimagining of Genesis 6, saying that these people feel fulfilled or satisfied with themselves after causing harm to others, thinking that they had done a good day's work, even though they had been abusive to other people. And this plays in perfectly with what he was talking about in the last verse, how you can have someone who looks like a righteous person, who dresses up in suit and tie and Sunday best and goes to church every time the doors are open, and yet they are actually a horrible human being who is taking pride in their mistreatment of other people, often in the name of God. This was very relevant to how I grew up as a fundamentalist Christian, because we saw anyone, and I do mean anyone, who wasn't exactly like us as this horrible, wicked, sinful enemy that we had to correct. And we often used that as an excuse to take out our own insecurities, our own anger, our own frustrations on those people and call it love because we were saving them from an eternity in hell. Just because you think you are right about something and somebody else is wrong about the same thing does not give you an excuse to treat them poorly or as less of a human being just because you think you have an answer that they need. Even if you really are right and they really are wrong, no one is going to be convinced by the kind of treatment that we tended to give. Harsh hellfire and brimstone preaching doesn't really get the point across. It just drives people away. And I realize there are harsh portions in the Bible, but not all of them. And this is the sort of thing that, you'd get preachers who say, well, I'm just preaching the Bible and the Bible's harsh sometimes, so I can be too. Now, there are a few harsh portions in the Bible, but not the whole thing. And we tended to be that way, I shouldn't say all the time, but in far greater proportion than matched the proportion of the Bible that had some harsh passages. And if we're being honest, pretty much every single harsh passage in the Bible is not against what we would think of as sinners or people outside of the body of God, but rather people within who were misusing their power and abusing their standing and mistreating other people. That's where the Bible's harshest critique lands, and that's not the way that we used it. We just used the fact that the Bible has a few harsh passages as a justification to get out our own anger and insecurities. When really, I think if Jesus were here, he would be correcting us for behaving that way toward other people, rather than correcting those people that we were so focused on. Verses 12 to 14 can feel a little bit jarring in relation to the rest of the book so far. They read, though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it will be well with them who fear God, who fear before him. But it won't be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he doesn't fear God. And then he goes on to say that some people who are righteous get treatment according to the way the wicked should be treated, and sometimes the wicked people get treated like they're righteous. This whole idea of, well, it doesn't actually matter how well off the wicked look or how poorly off the righteous look. In the end, God's got this all taken care of. That doesn't fit with a lot of what Qoheleth has said before. So some commentators go so far as to suggest that this is actually the insertion of the frame narrator. But it's also possible to read his I know statements in the book as meaning that he is familiar with this piece of common wisdom, but is about to critique it. So we've talked about this for 2 weeks straight now, where there's a difference among commentators. Some think that Qoheleth is presenting traditional wisdom that just falls in line with other wisdom literature, and he's agreeing with it. But that kind of makes him seem a little multi-personality. Like, which version of Qoheleth are we getting? The one that's radical and doesn't fit in with what everybody else seems to say? Or are we getting the one that's apparently believing traditional stuff all along? But there's another option where we can see that these times that he's presenting what seems to be traditional, established Orthodox wisdom, he might actually be holding it up for scrutiny and saying, this is a popular saying or belief that I'm familiar with, but that's not actually what I have found. And this is exactly what he does in verse 14. He says that I've seen the way people think life is supposed to happen isn't actually the way that always happens. You would think the righteous people will get success in life if God is trustworthy and good, and the wicked will get punished. But that's not always the case. So I think this is an instance where we can apply that same idea to verses 12 and 13. Because when he says, I know that it will be well with those who fear God, which fear before him, it's quite possible he's saying, I know that people say it will be well with them who fear God, who fear before him, but actually, that's not what I found. Here's the hevel I found on the earth, that there are righteous people who get a wicked treatment, and wicked people who get a righteous treatment. So I think that fits better. We don't have to assume that he's just gone schizophrenic here and forgotten everything he said before. And I also don't think we have to jump so far as to say that this is a later insertion by the editor who is too uncomfortable with what Qoheleth is saying. I think we can just look at this and say he is presenting common wisdom and saying, I know people say this, but that's not necessarily what I have found in my experience. Now, when he uses that word sinner, it says in verse 12, though a sinner do evil 100 times, that doesn't really mean sinner in the way that I think a lot of Christians would read it. Because we have co-opted that idea of being a sinner and turned it into something that every person is who has ever done one little wrong thing. I remember growing up and being trained on how to give a gospel presentation to someone, and we had this whole thing where we would go through a list of Bible commands and basically just keep going, especially through like the Ten Commandments was a popular one, and we would just keep going through them until the person we were talking to admitted to doing one of those things that they weren't supposed to do, breaking one of the commandments, and then we would say, "Aha, see, you are a sinner and you're on your way to hell. All we need is that one little sin. If I can prove that you have sinned one time in all of this life that you've had so far, then you're a sinner, and we kind of go back to total depravity. You're a horrible, rotten sinner." But that's not really what the word sinner means in the Bible, especially not in the Tanakh. It's not this general term for every single human being because we all do wrong. It's more so, I guess we could almost say, like the English word criminal. It's saying somebody who has fully devoted their life to sin. This is somebody who breaks the law, somebody who is abusive, somebody who's just a really horrible person. I think the best stereotype in our culture that I can think of is like if you have an old Western movie and there's the town drunk, and that's just how he's known, is all he is just this vagrant who sits around and does nothing but drink. That would be a sinner in the Bible's terminology, somebody whose life is defined by their vice. So, think about it in the New Testament, where there are a couple of passages that say that Jesus sat down with, I think it's usually publicans and sinners. Well, the way a lot of Christians think of the term sinner, that could mean anyone. Like, that could just be saying he sat down with anybody, and I guess it's in contrast to his sinlessness. But that's not the way the Bible means it. It means that he sat down with people whose life was fully defined by the questionable choices they had made. So here, Qoheleth is not saying, though a person who is obviously a sinner because they're a person does 100 bad things. No, he's saying, though you have a criminal who commits a crime 100 times and gets away with it, or though you have a drunk who gets a DUI 100 times, or though you have a domestic abuse situation where the person abuses their spouse or their kids 100 times. That's the idea he's talking about here. Now, when he says it will be well with those who fear God and it will not be well with the wicked, but pretty much every translation I could find puts those in the future. It will be well, or it will not be well. And that is possible. But it's also possible to read them in the present. In other words, it is good for those who fear God, but it is not good for the wicked. Saying right now that it is good or it is not good for the wicked. That is just a very general way of talking about the quality of life. We've consistently seen through the study that Qoheleth doesn't put hope in a future that is unknowable. He's not here saying, oh, just trust that one day God's going to make it all right. The wicked are going to face judgment and righteous people get to go to heaven. That's not what he's saying throughout the rest of the book, and so I don't think it's what he's saying here. I think he's talking about a present reality, saying that even though it seems like sometimes the wicked are better off than the righteous, that actually right now in this life, it is good for the righteous and it is bad for the wicked. And you say, well, how's that the case? Haven't we just observed that, the most successful people in life are often the crummiest people and vice versa? Well, in a way, yes, but is that actual true success? Just because someone is the CEO of a company or has a certain number of zeros in their bank account or drives a certain car or, fill in the blank with whatever your measure of success is, does that actually mean that they are happy? Well, no. And we practically worship celebrities in our culture, right? We want to be like them. We think, oh, if only I could live in a house like that. Oh, if only I had that sort of money. Oh, if only I had a relationship like that. If only I had that car or that job, or, fill in the blank with whatever. But look at how many of those famous people have been in a bunch of different relationships and divorced a bunch of times. Now, I'm not trying to shame anyone who has been divorced. Obviously, sometimes that happens. But, in a lot of these celebrity situations, it's happened a lot more than for the average person. Or look at how many of these famous people are addicted to one substance or another. Or they talk about how they have to work 80, 90, sometimes even 100 hours a week. Or, they're kids hate them because they didn't spend any time with them. Or, you start to actually drill down on some of this and you realize these people aren't any happier than the average person. We think they are because of the seeming success they have, but a lot of times they're just as, if not more miserable than your average Joe. So maybe the key is actually to stop focusing so much on that celebrity lifestyle. Yeah, I don't mean that you can't follow popular people or have a favorite actor or musician or, whatever. But we would do well to disavow ourselves of the notion that they are better off than we are. Just because they live in a fancier zip code or have a relationship with a supermodel or have a certain number of zeros in their bank account does not actually mean that they are living a good life. You can be single in a small apartment with no money in a bank and still be living a better life than a lot of celebrities and popular people that we look up to and idolize and try to base our lives off of. See, quality of life is not based on your bank account or physical attractiveness or political power or any of the things that we tend to look to for success. And I think this is what Qoheleth is talking about when he says fearing God. Remember a couple weeks ago when we discussed his teaching on don't be too righteous and don't be too wicked? The middle ground was fear God. And so I think really we just need to redefine our understanding of what it means to fear God. It's just such a nebulous term, and people have 100 different ideas of what they think. It's going to change based on whoever you ask. But it seems like fearing God is actually a middle ground between trying too hard and not trying enough. I kind of see it like when you're stuck in traffic and you have those people who won't even go out at a certain time of day because they're like, I just don't want to deal with the traffic. And then you have the other people who are constantly going back and forth and changing lanes. You know the sort of person I'm talking about. They drive us all insane. We are all stuck in the same traffic, and yet you see them just trying to swerve their way back and forth within the slightest gap they get. And, so now they're in the left lane, now they're in the right lane, now they're in the center, and they're just back and forth. And by the time we all get out of the traffic jam, they're maybe 100 feet ahead of you. You're going, did that really actually save you any time? Right? So I think fearing God is like the person who just realizes if I get in the left lane now, the right lane is going to be the one that starts to inch ahead. If I stay in the right lane, the left lane's the one that's going to start to inch ahead a little bit. So whichever way I go, I'm going to get there in about the same amount of time. And if I'm constantly trying to switch lanes just to game a little bit ahead of the next person, I'm just making it harder on everybody else. But if I don't try at all and I just stay home, well, then that's no good either. So if I just accept we're going to get there when we're going to get there, it takes so much stress off of the trip, right? And you still get there, so you still get to enjoy it, and you're not constantly trying to get ahead of everyone else by a few inches. That's like what fearing God is realizing sometimes the road of life has traffic jams. And there is no gaming that. There's no driving up the shoulder or quick switching lanes that's going to get you there faster than everyone else. You just have to realize that the road is the road. Sometimes it sucks, but we're all going to get to where we need to go. And I really think that's the idea of fearing God that's present here. But realize too that fearing God is not a way to game the system. It's not saying you'll get there faster than everyone else. It's just saying you're not going to stress yourself out about how fast you're going to get there. There is no gaming the system. There is no getting around traffic. You have to go through traffic, but you can either do it completely stressed out, trying to weasel your way up a few extra inches, or you can just acknowledge that it's going to happen and do your best with where you are. Fearing God is just trusting the process that you can make it work where you're at without needing these delusions of grandeur that you're going to save the world or change the world. Now, everyone can make a little difference, but we have to also come back to earth a little bit and realize that our ideals aren't going to completely resolve all of the world's conflicts in this lifetime. To fear God is to trust that you're where you need to be for a reason. Now, that being said, I think it's also worth noting that in the ancient world where this would have been written, people didn't really get to move around in their social standing like we can today. Today you can be in a lower class, middle class, upper class, and the American dream idea is that no matter how low on the totem pole you are, you can work your way up. And there's some aspects of that that are true. There's other aspects in which not so much. I'll talk about that more in a second here. But, in the ancient world, if you were on the lowest realm of society, you didn't really have any chance of moving up. You were stuck where you were at. So, for somebody who is stuck on that lowest rung, which is very much the culture that the Bible was written in, the Jewish people were usually the underdogs in the story. They were usually the ones who were oppressed and abused. So, when you're in that situation, there's something comforting in the belief that I am where I am supposed to be and life is going to work out. But I think it's worth asking, does our ability to change our circumstances today change that teaching? Should we rethink this teaching in light of our current society? Because, yeah, sometimes there is value in just being resigned to the reality of where you are and saying, I can't change this, so I'm just going to make the most of it where I am. But there's also times when we have more agency in our modern world than most human beings throughout history have had. So, shouldn't we use that and try to change our circumstances if we are able to? Remember, the Bible is a dynamic book, and how we apply it can change over the ages. So, this is worth thinking about, and I'd love to hear from you all. Like, what do you think about this particular teaching? Is it better to just acknowledge the reality of where you're at, for better or for worse, and just say, I'm going to make the best of a bad situation? Or, if you have agency, should you try to change your circumstances to be better all around? Honestly, I think it's just going to be a case by case basis. In some circumstances, it's best just to abide where you are and say, I'm going to make the best of a bad circumstance. But then there's other situations where I think it's better to stand up and try to make a difference. And that's probably just going to be different in every situation. The word biblical commentary points out in verse 12 that Qoheleth's comment is really just a throwaway. It's an aside where he says that the sinner does evil 100 times and his days be prolonged. That itself implicitly questions the justice of God in the government of the world, because a long life is a well-known symbol of happiness in the Bible, especially in the wisdom tradition. So that's something I didn't catch when I was first going through it, but I appreciated their note there, that he's kind of got something a little subversive going on right there. Moving into verse 13, a lot of English translations assume the phrase like a shadow modifies days, but it actually seems to modify the word prolong. You say, well, what's the big difference? Well, if it modifies days, you have him saying, the wicked will not prolong his days, which are like a shadow. So, in other words, his days are like a shadow, and you kind of get the idea of them being like Hevel. They pass before you know it. The sun rises and the shadow's gone. But if you take it as going with prolong, then it reads that it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong like a shadow his days. So, in that idea, you get the concept of a shadow just kind of being prolonged away from a person. Like as you're facing the sun, it drags out way taller than you actually are. So, it kind of gets across the same idea that, the person isn't going to live as long as it might seem. But I think the second idea makes it seem even shorter. Like he's saying their days aren't even like a shadow, it's even less than that. And that idea comes from the Net Bible Notes, so I think they're onto something there. Verse 14, there is a hevel, a vanity that's on the earth. There are righteous people unto whom it happens according to the work of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I say again, this is hevel. This could either be saying that bad things happen to good people and vice versa, or it could be saying that the righteous suffer unjustly for the crimes of the wicked, while the wicked seem to thrive off the merits of the righteous. And in a very collectivist culture like the ancient Near East, I think there's something to that second idea. And so we just come back to the idea that Bible Project has presented for this, that you are not going to be able to figure out the glitch in the system. There's a lot that we can't know in life. So then he presents a way that you can live in light of that realization. Brown in the interpretation commentary says Qoheleth's skeptical view on attaining theological knowledge should, if anything, give people of faith, and theologians in particular, pause for thought. That the Lord works in mysterious ways is not an empty cliche for Qoheleth. Mystery is endemic to the deity, Qoheleth claims, and it's the same mystery with which all of life under the sun is fraught. Qoheleth has observed that for every course of action in one direction, there occurs in due time an accompanying opposite reaction, a sort of Newtonian approach to moral valuation. Indeed, time itself is structured by such polarities. God has made the day of shalom and the day of adversity. Chapter 7, verse 14. The incessant oscillations between the good and the bad that comprise what is done under the sun, accompanied by the countless absurdities of human conduct, serve to veil the Almighty from all human perception and knowledge. God's intentions and purposes are shrouded in secrecy in the triumphs and travails of life. Qoheleth's statement that God is in heaven and you on earth, chapter 5, verse 2, illustrates the gulf that divides the transcendent from the mundane, and while it entails spareness of speech in its immediate context, Qoheleth's theology leads more broadly to humble confession of humanity's finitude and limited discernment, a bitter pill that even the wisest of the wise must swallow. End quote. In verse 15, we cycle back to reconsider Qoheleth's fourfold path for the good life. Previously, he had stated it as eating good food, drinking good beverages, working a job that you don't absolutely hate, and spending time with people that you care about. Here he cuts it down just to 3. Verse 15 says, I commended mirth, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be joyful, because that will abide with him of his labor the days of his life which God gives him under the sun. In chapter 2, verse 2, he had questioned, what does joy accomplish? And that word for joy in Hebrew is simka. Well, that's the same word that we have here that's translated mirth. So earlier he said, what good is joy? What does it accomplish? And here he says, well, actually, it's the best thing that we have in life. So we have to hold these two statements in tension and realize that in chapter 2, he was seeking for something that lasted beyond this life, something that could carry on past the grave. And he came to the realization that just like we come into this world with nothing, so we leave it with nothing. All of life is hevel. It's all like a bubble. You can appreciate the pretty shimmering bubble, but if you try to grab onto it, you're going to make it pop even faster than it was originally going to disappear. And joy, mirth, laughter, rejoicing, good times, parties, none of that lasts. You know, you can have an amazing party one night and the next day have something horrible happen and it's the worst day of your life. Joy does not last any more than any other emotion does. But that doesn't mean that's wrong or that we should look down on people who are enjoying life. If anything, this is where this verse comes in, and now he says, actually, this is the best we've got. He literally says, man has no better thing under the sun. Basically, if I can put it into a nice southern English, there exists nothing gooder to a human in life than to eat, drink, and party. I think there might be a subtle play on words in Hebrew that you miss in English because the words for drink and rejoice sound kind of similar. They are shintot and simot. So I think there could be something going on there. But the idea of this verse is that life is eating, drinking, and having an occasional party. Like, that's what life is made up of. There are only so many days you can go without eating, drinking, and having a good laugh. Remove any one of those long enough from your life, and you will die. You know, food and water are pretty obvious, but even joy. Depression is real. We need times of joy and laughter and partying in our lives, and we don't seem to realize how important the emotional aspect of us as people is. We make sure to eat something every day. We make sure to drink something every day. Heck, we make sure to take some time to sleep every day. And yet we forget to look out for our own emotional well-being, which is honestly just as important to a thriving life. This is life. See, very few of us actually get to spend every minute doing what we love. Most of us have to spend a good chunk of our life working jobs we don't like, and doing things that don't really bring us happiness. But we all have to eat, drink, and interact with other human beings. So, isn't it so funny that those are the three things that Qoheleth points to as the best things in life? He doesn't point to anything, literally anything, that is possible only for certain people. He doesn't say the best things in life are a vacation. The best things in life are money in the bank. The best things in life are having these many changes of outfit. The best things in life are having these many cars, or these many kids, or this kind of house, or this sort of job. No, he doesn't say anything about anything that is contingent on a person's situation. Eating, drinking, and interacting with other human beings is universal. We all do that every single day. And so that is the genius of his statement here. I think that's why he says these are the best things in life. See, we chase after all those things that not everybody has. You can try your whole life and you might still never make $1 million in the bank account. You can try your whole life and you might not have a successful business venture, or the house that you want, or the car that you want, or the number of kids that you want, or fill in the blank with whatever it is. But those aren't the things that are best in life. That's not the good life. The good life is what you already have. If every single thing got stripped away from you this instant, if God snapped his fingers, and turned you into Job, took away all of your money, took away your entire family, your house gets destroyed in a tornado, you are literally destitute. If you are able to obtain food and something to drink, and chances are you have to get that from someone else, so there's your third thing. You have an interaction with someone who is helping you out. You have the best things in life. And notice he doesn't say these are the things you need to survive. No, he says this is the good life. That's the beauty in it, because we all experience that. Those three things can continue with you even in times of trouble. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to make a little bit of money, or attempt that business venture, or go for that relationship, or try to have your dreams and reach your goals in life. Do all of that 100%. You only get one life. Like, if you have a bucket list, try to check stuff off of it. Do what you can to enjoy this life and whatever opportunities you have. But don't think that those things are what is going to bring you lasting happiness. Don't think that once you check off the last item on your bucket list, you're going to be happy. That's not how it works. Now, those things can bring enjoyment, but they are not going to bring ultimate satisfaction. Ultimate satisfaction is always available to every single human being right in front of us if you just have food, drinks, and human interaction. That's all we really need to live the good life. But isn't it so interesting that those are the very things that we here in America tend to take for granted and completely overlook? We have turned food into fast food. We eat in the car. We eat while we're working. We guzzle down our drinks. We take for granted the people who are around us, and sometimes we don't even know the names of our neighbors, right? We get to this point where the things that matter most are the things that we treat as least important because we're so used to them. But just because something is a physical necessity doesn't also mean that it can't be an emotional necessity. What if your physical need for food is tied to an emotional need to enjoy that food? What if your physical need for a drink is tied to an emotional need to enjoy a good beverage? What if your physical need for human interaction, which is a very real thing, by the way, we all learned that during COVID, is also attached to your emotional need for connection with other human beings? See, I kind of think of it like Mary Poppins, where she tried to make a game out of the chores that the kids had to do. Maybe if we can find a way to make a game out of the necessities of life and treat them as joys rather than necessities, we'll be able to find ourselves enjoying most of life. Because most of life isn't made up of the vacations and the fun stuff that we just end up living from one Friday to the next. We judge our entire week based on how many days it is until the weekend. Well, the weekend only makes up 2 days. So what if instead of living Monday through Friday, waiting for 5 p.m. Friday, we started enjoying Monday for what it is, Tuesday for what it is, Wednesday for what it is. I see we live our whole lives just waiting for the next thing. And what we end up doing then is missing out on all of the liminal space in between. Most of life is made up of Mondays through Fridays. That's 5/7 of the week, which anyone who's good at math can try to figure out a percentage there. I'm not going to bother. But why are we so focused on just trying to enjoy the things that we can control? It's no wonder we're so miserable in our culture. It's no wonder that there's so much depression and anxiety on the rise in our culture. I think it's because we are prioritizing the weekends in life, metaphorically and literally speaking sometimes, when most of life happens Monday through Friday. What if you can find a way to make a game out of Monday through Friday? What if you can find a way to sprinkle a little of the weekend in Monday through Friday? What if you start looking for little pleasures on Monday through Friday? Take it a little bit more slowly. Maybe instead of just focusing on all of the ways that the week went wrong, all the stuff we like to complain about, and that's fine, we have to process that stuff, we have to talk about it. But what if we tried to take an equal measurement of some things that went well? See, this is the genius of Qoheleth's message. And this is about so much more than just putting on a fake smile and gaslighting yourself into focusing on the good things in life and being happy when you're actually not. Now, in Qoheleth's mind, this is how you win life. This is how you actually beat evil. Because in this whole couple of chapters here, he's been talking about how evil, wicked, abusive, bad people seem to thrive when good people seem to struggle. Well, we can't actually change a lot of the big stuff in life. Most of us aren't that influential. Most of us aren't going to end up in a history book after we're dead. So we don't really have the capacity to change a lot about the wickedness and evil and abuse and oppression and injustice in the world. But the way that we can beat evil in our own lives is by not succumbing to the myth of the American dream, that if you just keep working a little bit harder, put in another 10 hours this week, that you're going to be successful and then you're going to be happy. Honestly, that's a lie. And there's a reason that we keep buying into it, because we see the few success stories and we think that could be me. The American dream is like the lottery. It does work for a few people, but for most people, it causes more harm than good. And again, there is nothing wrong with chasing your dreams. I am all for that. But when you put that up as the only hope that you have, as the thing that you're working toward in order to be happy, once I reach this point, once I cross that line, once I get this thing, then I will have accomplished what I wanted to in life. Then I will have reached the finish line. Then I will be happy. Then I get to retire. Then I get to enjoy life. That's a lie. You will never reach that point. And it's just going to keep sucking the life out of you in the meantime until you get too old to actually enjoy the little bit of life that you have left. So Qoheleth is saying this is how you beat that mindset in your own life, by enjoying the life that you have in front of you. He's talked so much in this chapter about power, and that's something that many people chase after, thinking, if I get that, then I'll be able to make a real difference. Then I'll be happy if I have that position, if I have that money, whatever it is. But maybe what you actually have to do is lose power or reject power in order to experience real joy. And I don't think Qoheleth is just speaking out of his butt and making this all up here. I think this is perfectly in line with what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are you when other people abuse you. None of that makes sense. Since when is poverty a sign of blessing from the gods? Since when is a humble lifestyle a sign of blessing from the gods? Since when is being mistreated a sign of blessing from the gods? Jesus, what are you talking about? See, he's not saying this in a prescriptive way of like, oh, you should seek this sort of thing. Like, you should try to have people mistreat you so that God will bless you. No, he's saying that right now you actually have blessing. See, the lie of culture is that you have to be well off in order to be happy. You have to be politically powerful in order to be happy. You have to have a certain amount of money in order to be happy. You have to have a certain job in order to be happy. You have to have a 401k and all of this laid out for the next 20 years of your life in order to be happy. And Jesus says, well, actually, all of us can be happy right now. And he pulls out all of these illustrations of the least of us in society, the very bottom rung of the ladder, and says, actually, those people are able to experience the good life just as much as everybody else. And in fact, sometimes maybe even more, because they realize the value of the little things that they have. See, that's what we've missed out in our modern culture. We have so much, we have forgotten the value of the little blessings, and we just keep striving for the next thing. And believe me, I am 100% guilty of that myself. Our consumerist American culture with the American dream ideal, it promises success if you just keep pushing hard enough. And Qoheleth says, actually, that's a sure way to die young and enjoy nothing. And even then, there's no actual guarantee. It's still a gamble. Consciously choosing to slow down and just find enjoyment in the moment you're in, with no greater motive than that, is the only real way to win in life. Verse 16, Qoheleth says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to see the busyness or the business that is done upon the earth, for there is also that neither day nor night sleeps with his eyes. Now, that is a very difficult sentence to translate there at the end of the verse. Literally, it's because there is not one who sees sleep with his eyes day or night. And part of what makes this so difficult is arguably it's an unnecessary aside. It doesn't really make sense in the context of his sentence, and the sentence makes more sense without it there. But the idea seems to be either that devoting your life wholly to an obsessive pursuit, even of a good thing, leads only to anxious sleeplessness and no real answers. Or that even if you could stay awake all 24 hours of the day, you still wouldn't be able to make the puzzle pieces of life fit. Word Biblical Commentary points out that this see sleep phrase is unique in the Bible, but there is some similarity to a couple of Latin quotations that they found from some Roman writers, particularly Terence and Cicero. One that said, I did not sleep with my eyes last night, and then the other that said, he did not see sleep. So some similarity there that suggests that this might have just been some terminology that was in the cultural language of the day, but doesn't really make a lot of sense to us anymore. In verse 17, he rounds out this part by returning to and rewording his introduction from the chapter. He says, I beheld all the work of God, that a human can't find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a person labor to seek it out, he's not going to find it. Indeed, even though a wise person thinks he knows it, he's not going to be able to find out. This goes back to the very start of the chapter where he's like, who here thinks they've got it all figured out? Who thinks they're a wise person? Who thinks they have answers? Actually, you don't know nothing. And he's not saying that we should stop trying to figure out life's mysteries. He's not saying that we should just pull the mystery card and say, well, we won't be able to know that, so, oh well, I guess we shouldn't even try. No, keep trying, but just be realistic about it. Don't have these delusions of grandeur that say, I'm going to figure out all of the world's problems. I have the answer to everything. If everyone would just listen to me, the world would be so much better, right? We all feel that way sometimes. And that's the sort of thing that he's trying to talk us back from the ledge a little bit and say, well, actually, let's just temper it and realize that life is going to continue on. It's always going to be complex. There's always going to be problems. And yes, we can inch our way closer to progress and solutions, and we can maybe even help to be a part of solutions for little issues. But we aren't going to fix the kink in the system. We're not going to fix the glitch that he's been talking about through this whole thing. We're not going to actually make a perfectly functioning world. But we can make it a little bit better, and that is always worth a try. As we're entering these last several chapters of the book now, Qoheleth is giving us a lot more practical take-home wisdom. Now, it's still not easy. It still takes a lot of meditation, consideration, and life change, really. We have to be willing to let what he says tear down our assumptions about what a good life is. And we have to rebuild with the realization that maybe we have had it all along. I hate to sound so cliche with that, of like, the joy is actually in the journey, but there's a lot of truth in that. There's a reason that became such a cliche saying, because we focus so much on the destination when really what matters is the journey that gets us there. And there's been a kind of a resurgence amongst theologians in the last probably decade or so now, talking about something called liminal space. I mentioned it a little bit earlier in the episode. And that's the idea of a place that you don't try to get to. It's a place that helps you get to the next place. Think of it like an airport is the standard illustration. No one just goes to an airport, right? You don't go there just as a destination. You are going there in order to get to the next place. And so we don't focus on the airport. We focus on the destination that we're trying to get to. But we can't get there without going to the airport. So there have been a lot of philosophers and theologians in the last decade or so who are trying to slow us down and say, well, maybe you shouldn't just rush through the airport in order to get to the destination. Maybe you should try to find something enjoyable in your experience at the airport and in the flight, because most of life is made up of that liminal space, that area in between. You only spend so much time at your destination. Most of life you spend traveling to get there. And we can easily apply that to so many different situations. So there's a lot of wisdom in just slowing down and appreciating where you are, even if it's not where you want to be yet. You'll get there, but right now you're not there. So why be miserable now? Why not just try to find something worth enjoying in this time before you get to the ultimate goal? There's a lot of beauty in that, and it really takes some thought to change our thought process, because that's so difficult to accept. At least I know it is for me. So I've really been challenged by what Qoheleth has shared in these chapters. I hope you have as well. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can comment on our socials. You can leave a comment if you listen on Spotify. There should be an option there in the app if you listen on your phone. You can send us an email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com, and you can also write in on our website. I do want to mention, I brought this up a week or two ago, but we have a special event coming up on the 5th of July. It'll be in the evening. We are going to be having a watch party together. We'll have a Zoom meeting. We all get together and we watch an old Bob Jones classic movie, Sheffy, about an old traveling evangelist at the turn of the century. I believe it was 18 into 1900s. And we're going to evaluate how much of it has withstood the test of time and how much maybe hasn't aged well. So that's going to be really fun. We'll be putting out a social media post or two in the coming weeks here. Definitely recommend you join us on that. I don't know if we're going to be able to have a recording of that, so it's probably going to be a one-time only live event. But that's going to be super cool. I also want to let you know that within a couple of weeks here, we're going to be releasing an episode that we did with a new guest on the podcast. His name is Eric Seibert, and he has written quite a few books now on the topic of violence in the Bible, and particularly divine violence in the Bible. And how do we handle that? How do you wrestle with the violent portions of Scripture, and particularly ones where either God is the person enacting violence, or he seems to approve of human violence that would make us really uncomfortable. And his focus is a lot on the Old Testament too. It's a very common question that people bring up, like, what do I do with such violence in the Bible? How should we respond? Is that still relevant for us today? Should we respond differently as Christians? So we get into all of those questions. It is a great episode, and I don't say that to toot my own horn. I mean the content that Eric brings into it. All I did was ask the questions. He's the one that made it great with everything he said. So I am really looking forward to when that gets released. It'll probably be in the next month, or I'd say it'll be in about the next month here. So keep an eye out for that. Next week we'll be hopping into Ecclesiastes chapter 9. And there's some really, really interesting tie-ins there to other ancient works of literature. So some that we've already talked about, and maybe even a couple that we haven't gotten into yet, come out in that chapter. It's very similar to Proverbs, So it's just these little pockets of wisdom sayings, but there is a lot there for us to dig into. So I am excited for that as well. And until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.